There are people who are not lacking in intelligence, not lacking in sensitivity, and not lacking in depth. Yet they are always tired. Tired from thinking too much. Tired from feeling too deeply. Tired from noticing what others do not see in the eyes, in the tone of voice, in the pauses that seem meaningless. If you have ever wondered why you cannot live simply like others, why your mind keeps working even when everything outside appears calm, you may belong to the group of people who are too aware. The problem is not that you are weak, nor is it because you are pessimistic. It is because your consciousness opened too early, too deeply, and without an off switch. You live while simultaneously observing yourself living. You love while analyzing whether that love is real. You connect while sensing the risk of being wounded behind every act of intimacy. In this video, we will go deep into the psychology of those who are over-awake, where awareness can be both a gift and a burden. You will understand why depth often walks alongside loneliness, why high empathy so easily leads to exhaustion, and most importantly, how awareness can stop being a curse and become lived wisdom. If you have ever felt that you see too much to remain carefree, stay. This story may be speaking about you. There is a kind of light that does not shine outward into the world, but turns inward toward the human interior. It does not make things more dazzling, but makes them so clear that they cannot be ignored. Deep awareness belongs to this kind of light, quiet, persistent, and impossible to switch off. It seeps into the smallest details of life, illuminating fractures that familiar surfaces usually conceal. For most people, awareness exists at a sufficient level, enough to live, enough to adapt, enough to keep moving without lingering too long on every glance or every pause. But for those with deep awareness, enough is a foreign concept. They see more than is necessary to survive. They feel more than is necessary to belong, and they understand more than is necessary to feel safe. In this case, awareness is not knowledge or logical reasoning ability. It is an inner lens that is always open, where no detail is truly meaningless. A smile that fades half a second too early. A glance that avoids. A barely perceptible hesitation in the voice. These things do not pass by. They remain. They are registered. And they demand to be understood. These individuals do not live only in the world unfolding before their eyes, but also in the world unfolding beneath it. They do not experience reality as a single linear flow, but as a multi-layered structure, where every action carries a motive, and every word holds an unspoken depth. Their consciousness does not stop at what is happening, but continuously slides toward why this is happening in this way. And it is precisely here that awareness begins to become a burden, because this is not a choice that can be turned on and off. It is how they exist. Like opening one's eyes is seeing, like hearing is recognizing pitch. Their minds do not know how to simplify experience. Life, for them, is not a sequence of events that pass naturally, but resembles a series of invisible equations constantly appearing, constantly demanding solutions. Why does the atmosphere in the room suddenly grow heavy, though no one speaks? Why does a familiar response today carry a different tone? Why does intimacy suddenly become awkward after a single, seemingly insignificant sentence? These questions do not arise from suspicion, but from an overly sensitive attunement to misalignment between surface and depth, between what people display and what they are actually carrying inside. And when someone must live continuously in this state of decoding, exhaustion does not arrive loudly. It accumulates, quietly, but relentlessly. This is not physical fatigue, not exhaustion from labor or responsibility. This is the fatigue of a consciousness that never rests, a form of mental depletion in which the mind is always lit, even in moments that should be simple and safe. A light conversation becomes a space for analysis. An intimate meal carries signals that must be read. Even silence is not allowed to be empty. Gradually, life loses the innocence necessary for ease. Joy is no longer whole, because it is always accompanied by the question, is this real or merely a temporary display? Connection is no longer effortless, because every relationship is viewed through the lens of motive, expectation, and the potential for harm. When consciousness expands to the point where a person both lives and stands outside observing themselves living, a subtle division begins to form. They feel emotions while simultaneously analyzing them. They participate in the moment while continually asking how they are appearing within it. A part of them is always inside, observing, evaluating, adjusting. There is no dramatic collapse, no overt disorder, only a quiet, prolonged fatigue where the mind is rarely allowed to fully relax. And it is here that deep awareness begins to take the shape of a curse. Not because it is wrong, but because it is unbalanced. When there is no capacity to let go, light becomes blinding. When there is no trust in the natural flow of life, understanding turns into a burden. Yet it would be unfair to view deep awareness solely as a source of suffering. For those who see too much are often the ones who understand human fragility most clearly. They know that a smile can conceal fear, that kindness can grow from old wounds. And because of this, they possess a rare form of empathy. Empathy not rooted in ideals, but in a deep understanding of human nature. The problem is not that they see too much. The problem is that they often have to carry it alone. When there is no space for reflection, no one to help them set boundaries for their awareness, depth can slide from wisdom into anxiety, from understanding into vigilance, from light into exhaustion, and that is the moment when the gift begins to resemble a curse. But to understand why depth so often accompanies a sense of alienation, why heightened awareness walks hand in hand with loneliness, we need to go one layer further into the psychological mechanisms beneath this state, where double observation, heightened empathy, and inner conflicts gradually come into clearer view. There is a very characteristic moment when deeply aware individuals begin to feel out of sync with the world, not because they do not understand life, but because they understand too clearly how it operates. At this level, awareness is no longer a light illuminating the outside world, but becomes a complex inner mechanism, where a person both lives and observes themselves living. Metacognition sits at the center of this mechanism. These individuals do not simply feel sadness, joy, anxiety, or love. At the same time, they observe how that emotion is unfolding, where it comes from, whether it is reasonable, and whether it is allowed to exist. Before an emotion has time to fully spread, it is already examined, analyzed, and questioned. They do not merely experience emotions, they evaluate the experience itself. This double observation creates a rare depth, but it also creates a profound distance. They are like someone dancing while constantly glancing at a mirror to check every movement. There are no major mistakes, yet there is rarely complete relaxation. The present moment is always split in two, one part living, one part standing outside and watching. When a person cannot fully inhabit the moment, their natural connection with the world begins to thin. Joy arrives, but not entirely. Sadness appears, but is quickly analyzed. Even love loses its original purity because it is immediately placed within a framework of expectations, risks, and the possibility of being hurt. The inner world becomes deep, but also distant. This distance grows more pronounced as they begin to notice subtle contradictions in human behavior, things that most people can overlook in order to continue playing their role in the social performance. They see with striking clarity. Words and intentions do not always align. Kindness sometimes carries an expectation of return. Love, at times, is mixed with a need for control, fear of loss, or a desire for validation. Seeing through this veil does not make them bitter. It makes them cautious. They no longer easily believe in simple narratives. They are no longer comfortable entering relationships based solely on surface emotions. And when unconditional trust is no longer possible, people begin to step back, not to attack, but to protect themselves. Loneliness here does not come from a lack of people around. It comes from no longer sharing the same way of seeing the world. When you perceive the motives beneath actions, when you sense the inconsistency between what is said and what is actually happening, participating in social life with original innocence becomes difficult. You are still present, still smiling, still conversing, but at a very deep level, you know you are standing outside. This feeling is a discrete form of loneliness, not loud, not tragic, but persistent. It is like sitting in a room full of people, hearing lively conversation, yet never truly touching anyone. Not because you do not want to, but because you cannot pretend not to know what you have already seen. This burden grows heavier when paired with heightened empathy. Deeply aware individuals often sense others' emotions, even before they are named. They notice tension in a room when no one speaks. They feel affection fading before it is acknowledged. They hear exhaustion behind a calm voice. Empathy, in this case, is no longer simply the ability to place oneself in another's position. It is more like having no clear boundary between one's own emotions and those of the person in front of them. They do not just understand another's sadness, they carry it inside themselves. They do not just recognize anxiety, they allow it to touch their own nervous system. This amplified sensitivity makes existence sharper. Every space carries signals. Every relationship holds emotional weight. Every small shift is felt as a real vibration. What others can overlook, in order to continue living, they must process internally. Gradually, they learn to withdraw, not because they do not care, but because caring too much exhausts them. They choose silence not because they lack words, but because they have already felt enough. They choose to stand at the edge, not because they are cold, but because they know they will be affected if they step in too deeply. At this level, loneliness is no longer the result of not being loved. It is the result of loving and understanding too much in a world that is not always ready to receive such depth. When you see contradictions, when you sense hidden fears, you no longer move easily within shallow relationships, yet the world is largely built upon precisely those surfaces. The most painful part is not seeing others' masks. It is having to decide to keep seeing or to pretend not to see in order to belong. And in many cases, they choose to see, not because they are stronger, but because they do not know another way to exist without betraying themselves. Yet it is precisely at this point of apparent separation that a deeper question begins to form. If heightened awareness leads to loneliness, if deep empathy leads to exhaustion, where does this state truly originate? Why do some individuals have to learn how to read the world so early, and what in the past shaped this psychological mechanism that is both profoundly perceptive and profoundly distant? The answers to these questions will lead us into the next part, where the origins of deep awareness and the gradual process of alienation begin to reveal themselves. Deep awareness rarely emerges by accident. It does not form out of leisure, nor does it arise within environments of absolute safety. Most of the time, it is cultivated very early, during years in which a child is forced to observe far more than normal. in order to survive. Not survival in a biological sense, but emotional survival. In unpredictable environments where adults' emotions shift erratically, where safety is not guaranteed, where love comes with conditions, a child learns a crucial skill even before learning language: reading the room. They listen to the tone before words. They observe facial expressions before trusting what is said. They sense tension in the air before conflict breaks out. At first, this is vigilance, a subtle survival reflex. But over time, vigilance becomes habit, and habit becomes deep awareness. That child has no choice. They cannot withdraw. They cannot confront. They can only observe, register, adjust. They learn to move lightly within the emotional worlds of others to avoid making things worse. They develop an internal radar system sensitive enough to detect the smallest shifts, fast enough to respond before danger arrives. And as the years pass, that system does not disappear. It grows up with them. The problem is this: what once helped them survive later distances them from life. Once accustomed to viewing the world through the lens of vigilance, it becomes difficult to return to a state of innocence. They carry this alertness into every relationship. Every conversation is replayed in the mind. Every reaction is analyzed. Every word is placed within the context of intention, vulnerability, and the risk of disappointment. It is here that a profound paradox takes shape. The ability to understand the world, to understand motives, emotions, and human complexity becomes the very thing that pushes them away from it. They no longer trust easily, no longer surrender easily to experience, not because they do not long for connection, but because they have seen too much that makes connection fragile. They realize that not every kindness is unconditional. Not every act of care comes from pure goodwill. Not every promise is kept. These small falsehoods, not large enough to be called betrayal, but numerous enough to erode trust, accumulate in their minds, and once seen, they cannot pretend they were never there. Alienation does not begin by separating from others, but by separating from simplicity. They become cautious. They no longer say the first thing that comes to mind. They no longer share emotions the moment they arise. They review their words, not to manipulate, but to avoid hurting others and to avoid being hurt themselves. Gradually, distance appears, small but consistent. That distance makes them seem cold, difficult to approach, or overly rational. But inside, they are not lacking in emotion. On the contrary, they feel too much. And precisely because of this, they are forced to build intricate layers of defense so as not to be submerged by what they feel. At a deeper level, excessive awareness often walks alongside anxiety. Not acute anxiety, but baseline anxiety, a low-grade, persistent tension in which the mind is rarely allowed to rest fully. The brain regions responsible for prediction, planning, and risk assessment operate continuously, generating an unending chain of questions. What if this happens? What will the outcome be if I say that? If I trust this time, will I be disappointed? It is the what-if machine, running without pause. Even when no real threat exists, the mind remains conditioned to search, because in the past, prediction was what helped them avoid pain. But in the present, this mechanism no longer protects. It exhausts. Anxiety, in this case, is not a sign of weakness. It is the legacy of a nervous system that once had to operate at excessive levels to ensure safety. And when that system is never taught how to turn itself off, it keeps running, even when danger is no longer present. Alienation, therefore, does not come from a lack of desire to belong to the world. It comes from the world no longer feeling like a place where they can relax. When every interaction is scanned through vigilance, when every relationship is weighed for risk, a person gradually stands outside their own life, still living, still working, still connecting, but always maintain a safe distance. The most painful part is this: they are acutely aware of that distance. They know they are holding themselves back. They know it makes them lonelier. But they also know that if they let go completely, they may be pulled back into old wounds, and between familiar loneliness and the risk of disappointment, they often choose the former. However, not every story ends here. Deep awareness, though born from vigilance and nurtured in instability, does not have to remain forever bound to alienation. But for that to happen, one new skill must be learned: not how to see more deeply, but how to place boundaries around one's own awareness, how to distinguish between past and present, between real danger and imagined threat. And it is precisely at this intersection that another path begins to open. A path that does not require the abandonment of depth, but asks one to learn how to live with it without being ruled by it. This is where awareness can transform from a survival mechanism into lived wisdom, a theme that will be further unfolded in the next part as we move into the journey of reconciliation and transformation. At some point, deeply aware individuals begin to recognize an exhausting paradox. They are not inactive, yet they cannot move forward. The mind is constantly in motion, but life itself feels stuck. This is where analysis paralysis emerges, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly locking a person inside their own capacity to think. This paralysis is not laziness. It is the consequence of living too long in predictive mode. Before the world has time to play out a single scenario, they have already lived through 10 in their mind. If I say this, what happens? If I stay silent, what follows? If I step forward, will I be hurt? If I step back, will I lose something? Every option is simulated, analyzed, and weighed. And while the mind runs endlessly, the body and real life remain still. At a deeper level, this is exhaustion. Exhaustion from having to understand. Exhaustion from having to anticipate. Exhaustion from carrying the responsibility of reading the world correctly. When every action must be emotionally safe, a person gradually loses the ability to act naturally, not because they lack motivation, but because they no longer believe action can be simple. The path of healing does not begin with thinking more. It begins with learning how to place boundaries around one's own awareness. Awareness without boundaries becomes suffering. When every signal is treated as important, the mind loses its ability to distinguish between what needs to be understood and what can be allowed to pass. Not every silence carries a message. Not every change is a warning sign. Not every glance requires decoding. Some moments are simply moments, and some people are simply tired, not hiding anything. The wisdom of letting go does not lie in shutting down awareness, but in discernment, choosing when to listen deeply, choosing when to pause, choosing to trust that not everything needs to be understood right now. When awareness is held within compassion toward oneself first, it ceases to be a burden. It becomes a gentle understanding. Letting go, in this case, is not turning away from depth. It is allowing oneself not to stand at the bottom of the ocean at all times. Sometimes, one must rise to the surface, breathe, allow life to remain ambiguous without rushing to fill it with answers. This is not a failure of awareness. It is a sign of maturity. As acceptance begins to take root, a subtle transformation unfolds. The deeply aware person starts to understand that life does not need to be perfect to be beautiful. People do not need absolute consistency to be lovable, and relationships do not need complete safety to be meaningful. Trust, not blind trust, but trust built through experience, begins to replace control. Here, the goal is not to turn off the mind. That is nearly impossible and unnecessary. The goal is to find stillness within the movement of the mind itself, to recognize when thought is protecting and when it is merely repeating old fear, to allow emotions to pass through without the immediate need to analyze, fix, or rationalize them. When awareness is balanced in this way, it begins to change form. From a survival mechanism, it becomes lived wisdom. From a burden, it becomes a support. The deeply aware individual is no longer dragged by every subtle signal, but learns to stand steady among them. They still see much, still feel deeply, but they are no longer swept away, and it is here that the final value of deep awareness reveals itself. These individuals carry within them a rare light, the light of understanding. They see the mask, yet do not become cynical. They understand the motives behind behavior, yet do not use that knowledge to judge. They know love is fragile, yet they still choose to offer it, not because they are naive, but because they understand the value of being fully present. They are those who truly know how to listen, not only to words, but to what remains unspoken. They bring into the world a different kind of connection, slower, deeper, and rarer. In a noisy age where everything is simplified, they remind us that depth still has a place. That understanding is not meant for control, but for loving more wisely. Awareness, in the end, is not a curse. It only becomes suffering when one has to carry it alone. When supported by acceptance, boundaries, and trust, it becomes the deepest form of living. A human being can reach a way of life that does not avoid truth, yet does not lose gentleness. And from here, as we look back upon the entire journey of those who are too aware, we can close this story not with a definitive conclusion, but with a gentle reminder about the meaning of depth in human life, a meaning that will be fully distilled in the final message. When looking back at the entire journey of those who are too aware, a quiet truth emerges. They were never meant to live lightly, they were meant to live deeply. Their awareness was once a guiding light, then became a burden, then led to loneliness, anxiety, and distance. But this was never a mistake, it was the path. What caused their suffering was never seeing too much, but having to carry everything alone without boundaries, without a place to set it down. And when they learn to let go just enough to trust in the imperfection of life, awareness begins to change form. It is no longer a curse, but becomes wisdom, no longer vigilance, but deep presence. These individuals see through masks, yet still choose kindness. They understand fragility, yet still dare to love. And in doing so, they remind us of this: living deeply has never been easy, but it has always been the way human beings touch the truest and most profound essence of themselves.